Hello and welcome to the Informed Animal Ally presented by the Vancouver Humane Society. This is the Animal Ethics Podcast where we share the ins and outs of topics like cruelty, legislation, and advocacy here in BC and across Canada. And welcome to a new year with the Vancouver Humane Society's podcast, The Informed Animal Ally. My name is Chantel Archambault, and I'm the Communications Director here at the VHS. To kick off 2024, I'm going to take you through some of the highlights from the show's first ever series on animal cruelty laws in Canada. If you're interested to learn more about any of the highlights in this episode, you can find all our previous series through the Informed Animal Ally wherever you get your podcasts or at vancouverhumane.ca/podcasts. First, let's delve back into an overview of the laws meant to protect pets in Canada from our episode called Companion Animal Cruelty Laws, released in May 2022. Companion animals within the laws in Canada are covered under a section of the Criminal Code that the title is kind of concerning to me. It's the willful and forbidden acts in respect of certain property.
Yeah, it's pretty dark to have property be the way that we think about animals. Unfortunately, that's the way they've been conceived in law essentially since the Canadian government started. One of the main sections of this law says that everyone commits an offense who willfully and without lawful excuse kills, maims, wounds, poisons, or injures dogs, birds, or animals that are kept for a lawful purpose. So these caveats, such as willfully and without lawful excuse, really permit for a lot of flexibility. And unfortunately, sometimes that flexibility means that animals suffer. Generally speaking, Indigenous laws are concerned with the goal of maintaining and restoring harmony within and between human and non-human relationships. Provincial laws are so different because each one has taken their best attempt at filling in the gaps of the criminal code. And every province and territory has a different law and different ways that they interpret the law, which can get pretty complicated when it comes down to knowing really what is and isn't acceptable in society.
And it's such a patchwork because not only is there a different code and a different written legislation in each province, but each province is subject to their own case law, and all the codes are interpreted and written differently. So Quebec is the only province with a civil code, which is more similar to the federal criminal code.
32 countries have formally recognized non-human animal sentience, and Canada isn't one of them. I'm hopeful that we'll see a change in our lifetime about that.
Laws don't exist in a vacuum. They're written by people and affected by the society in which they come to pass. So if the society values profits and relies on class distinctions and doesn't value human and animal life, the laws are going to reflect that.
Municipal laws can be helpful. They can provide a different level of regulation that allows for neighbors to better get along, that allows for the better care of animals. However, they also have a certain amount of leaving it up to interpretation to the individual doing the enforcement, which can be good and it can be bad.
There's definitely a huge lack of pet-friendly housing, and not only that, but it's more difficult for people who can access pet-friendly housing to keep it. For instance, there could be requirements to spay and neuter for people who don't have the resources to spay and neuter, and those resources aren't covered by the government or aren't available like other medical care would be because animals are not treated the same as humans. The next highlights will delve into the laws around animals who are bred, raised, and killed for meat, milk, eggs, furs, and other products used by humans. You can learn more in the episode called Farmed Animal Cruelty Laws, released in June 2022.
When when the Constitution Act was written, which passed in 1867, it outlined the distribution of powers between the central parliament and the provincial legislatures. And agriculture, being such a complex entity, was allocated to both, which has led to what I consider a long-lived tradition of hot potato, whereby no one wants to be responsible for the well-being of animals. The criminal code provisions, which we covered in the last podcast, may apply to farmed animals, but they also essentially have a lawful excuse provision. An entity that's called the National Farm Animal Care Council, or NFAC for short, created codes of practice that help to outline exactly what a lawful excuse is. They essentially outline the minimum generally accepted practices of animal management. So if a farmer does practices with their animals that fit within the code of practice requirements, then their actions would be considered a lawful excuse. There's many practices we would consider to be essential to the welfare of animals that are labeled in the codes as recommended practices, not requirements.
So there's currently no means in BC's legal system to address the cruelty of practices that are considered generally accepted in the codes.
Absolutely. And even more so, there's no proactive monitoring for the requirements of the codes because of the way they're incorporated into law. The codes sort of mention the importance of enrichment, but they don't mandate it in detail to say that they need access, for example, to nesting materials, which are really important for pigs. They love to make nests for their birthing areas. And as a result, they end up with behavior issues such as biting. And so then their approach to deal with that is to cut off their tails rather than to provide a better housing situation that fulfills their needs to use their mouths. The codes of practice truly are minimal in the protections that there are for animals, and even where there are requirements that help to protect welfare, there's no use of the codes from this proactive enforcement view by government. So there's not much that can confirm that these laws are being followed on farm. Auctions are typically regulated by the province's animal cruelty laws, so that would differ province by province, territory by territory. However, there's not usually anyone monitoring them. So the animals that are being sold at auction may not be in good condition, and auctions themselves are really scary and overwhelming for farmed animals as they're unfamiliar, they're loud, they involve a lot of uncomfortable and often cruel handling because they're trying to move animals along quickly. Similarly to all other situations where there's little oversight, animal suffering is the norm in these situations, and there is no laws that are being enforced to give them justice.
Animal agriculture is the largest scale animal welfare crisis today, in my opinion. There are more farmed animals than wild mammals on Earth, many of whom are raised on industrial farms. The land used to grow crops for farmed animals and to feed and raise and slaughter them leads to habitat loss for wildlife. If we fed those crops directly to humans, we could decrease our agricultural land use significantly, since about 45% of crops are currently fed to animals, while animal-based foods only produce 18% of our global calorie intake. And then runoff from animal waste and antibiotics impacts the health of our waterways and the fishes and other animals that live in them. So it's just not sustainable for our growing population to keep eating the amount of animal products that we're eating. I think a really interesting statistic that I saw was that if everyone on Earth ate the average Canadian diet, we would need 1.3 Earths just for agricultural land, and then more on top of that for us to live on.
That's not reasonable.
It's really not. It's an enormous demand, and that enormous demand is driving intensive animal agriculture to try to maximize the food output in the smallest possible space. And that leads to some of the most serious welfare concerns that we've talked about. Now that we've heard about some of the laws around farmed land animals, we'll hear about the laws around fishes. Fishes are impacted in huge numbers by human activity. About 70 billion land animals are killed for food each year, while the number of fishes killed annually is about 14 to 40 times that. You can learn more in the episode Fish Cruelty Laws, released in July 2022. In general, fishes raised or caught for food are covered under the Federal Fisheries Act in Canada. That act has been in place a very long time, since 1868, to regulate fisheries and fish management, including protecting fishes and their habitats and preventing waterway pollution. So the consideration for fish protection in this act is mainly concerned with maintaining fish stocks rather than protecting the welfare of fishes.
Fish farms do pose major welfare problems for fishes, both those being farmed and those in surrounding waterways. Carnivorous farmed fish like salmon, halibut, and tuna are fed diets made with fish meal and fish oil made from smaller wild-caught fish. Open net fish farms in particular are a major issue for surrounding fish because they're placed in the water, which means all of their waste, disease, and chemicals can seep out to the surrounding ecosystem. Fishes on farms are often kept in cramped and crowded conditions with no enrichment at all. We know that when we're stressed, we're more likely to get sick. And so when fishes are stressed in close quarters, they're more likely to get disease and parasites. Farms can combat this by relying heavily on antibiotics, but those antibiotics can lead to drug-resistant infections in humans, something that we understand is deeply impactful. And both antibiotics and parasites can make their way into surrounding water and impact wild fishes and other mammals. Talking about industrial fishing, this we know is also really harmful because it results in the mass deaths of fishes and also bycatch, which is the accidental capture of non-target species like dolphins, sea turtles, and diving birds.
Fishes are farmed in higher numbers than any other animal, so shifting away from animal products in your diet can save hundreds of fish lives every year. The greatest impact of cutting out fish from our diets comes from cutting out farmed fishes because of the high stress methods that are used throughout the whole fish's lives and their impact on wild fish populations as well. And then following that would be cutting out fishes caught in commercial fisheries. In addition to just cutting out fishes, cutting out farmed meat and animal products in general can also decrease the demand for industrial animal agriculture, which is a major source of water pollution because of the agricultural runoff from those farms. Agricultural runoff basically leads to the overgrowth of algae, which then decomposes in the water and depletes the water of oxygen. And then the fishes who live there can't survive in oxygen-depleted water, so they either die or they move elsewhere to compete for increasingly scarce territory and resources. These next highlights come from our episode Wildlife Cruelty Laws with Erin Ryan, published in September 2022. Erin specializes in wildlife welfare and holds a Master's of Science in Applied Animal Biology from the University of British Columbia's Animal Welfare Program, where her research focused on humane rodent control.
Even before there was a word within Western science for the one health, one welfare approach, that was largely how Indigenous people lived, was knowing that the way the health of the land was interconnected to the health of the animals and to the health of the people, and that we all share the system. And if one of us suffers, we all suffer. But if we take good care of each other, then we all can thrive.
We have the 3 levels of legislation to consider: federal, provincial, and municipal. Could you give a little bit of background for our listeners on what protections are in place for wildlife at those 3 levels?
So at the federal level, this largely looks at species that are particularly endangered or considered at risk or perhaps part of threatened habitats. It also provides protection to animals in protected areas like national parks or national nature reserves and things like that. One of the primary pieces of federal legislation that I deal with is the Federal Migratory Birds Convention Act, because it tends to be that all these migratory birds are not just present, as we know, in one locality or one province. They tend to move throughout the landscape. At the provincial level, we see the BC Wildlife Act, and that helps to fill in some of the gaps of how wildlife is managed at a provincial level. So this piece of legislation, and at the provincial level, is where we see things like hunting and trapping regulations. It also prescribes a few more pieces of legislation for things like wildlife feeding. So the BC Wildlife Act prohibits the feeding of dangerous wildlife like bears and wolves and cougars, but it does leave a big gap for other animals. And this is where municipal law can come in. So although some of those bigger, broader changes aren't necessarily the jurisdiction of municipality, it is still really important that municipal bylaws can fill in even more of some of those gaps. So if we take a look at wildlife feeding, municipalities have the power to say it's a ticketable offense to feed wildlife, and that can include all types of animals, whether it's raccoons or squirrels or geese in parks, in ways that are unhealthy and harmful. And unfortunately, even though it might feel good or catch a nice photo, we know that wildlife feeding rarely results in a good outcome, and the people who suffer are the animals.
In BC, there is a wolf cull that's ongoing, has been ongoing since I think 2015, where quite a large volume of wolves are being culled, essentially killed by helicopter and other means by the province and being paid for with tax dollars.
So at this point in time, the use of baiting and poisons and aerial shooting are all completely within the bounds of the law. I think we can look at this project and definitely disagree. The science all points towards habitat disturbance being the primary factor to caribou decline, which then allows wolves to access the landscape. But in that same sense of wildlife management versus wildlife stewardship, if we're trying to manage, we're not going to be able to shoot our way out of this problem. We have recent evidence showing that habitat restoration of these disturbed areas can restore the landscape and can protect caribou. And if you look at what your tax dollars are paying for, really, I would prefer to see my tax dollars invested in habitat restoration. So a lot of the legislation and sort of the big momentum change that's happening right now is regulating the use of what's called second-generation anticoagulants. So an anticoagulant is a poison which thin the blood. So it leads to bleeding and hemorrhaging, and usually death happens when the animals simply bleed out. So in sort of the early 1940s, 1950s, we developed what's called first-generation anticoagulants. So over time, animals developed resistance to these products, and there was sort of a lower toxicity, so it could take a few times of them ingesting this product before it would have its effect. For example, warfarin, we see a lot of resistance to this product, and for that reason, we look towards developing second-generation anticoagulants. So these products were designed to be much more toxic so that rodents could be poisoned after just a single feeding. However, that also meant that they're much more toxic in the environment, and they persist much more in the environment. And animals experience what's called direct poisoning or secondary poisoning. And direct poisoning is what we see happening to the mice and rats. So they're actually eating the poison, they're experiencing the effects of the poison. And secondary poisoning is when an animal like an owl, an eagle, a hawk eats a poisoned rodent carcass, and when they eat enough of that, they themselves experience this sort of secondary toxicity as it builds up in their system. And unfortunately, they experience the same suffering and the same effects. So we've noticed pretty profound levels of poisoning, and that concern for wildlife is largely what has driven legislative changes right now.
Now that we've spoken about wildlife in their natural habitats, let's delve into the laws around animals in captivity with guest Rob Laidlaw. Rob has spent more than 40 years working to protect the interests and well-being of animals in Canada and around the world. He's a chartered biologist, founder of the wildlife protection organization ZooCheck, an award-winning author, and a winner of the Frederick A. McGrand Lifetime Achievement Award for substantial contributions to animal welfare in Canada. The episode Animal Captivity Laws with Rob Laidlaw was published in October 2022.
In in 1984, I came across a zoo in Ontario, about 2 hours from Toronto, and it was what you would now call a roadside zoo. I didn't know those things existed, and I had actually bought the propaganda and thought that zoos were, I had a discomfort with them, but I thought generally speaking they were positives. I didn't know any better. But I visited this zoo. It was horrendous. The animals were living in excrement, literally a meter or two deep. They had been on it so long and they had compacted it into a concrete-like consistency. The cages looked like they had been banged up by a bunch of Boy Scouts over the weekend who got scrap materials from the dump. It was a horror story. Inquired at the admission booth when I left about one particular animal, which was a juvenile black bear that was chained by the neck in a small crate. And I said, that's not very good. Why is that bear in that circumstance? And they said, oh, don't worry, it's just temporary. The bear just came. He's going down the road to another facility. Well, I said, okay, great. At least it's temporary. And I visited the zoo he was going to after I left that one, and it was worse. I thought naively that what I saw, both those facilities, were anomalous. Maybe it had been a situation where thousands of people went there, but everybody thought everybody else had complained when nobody had complained. Mm-hmm. It was that kind of maybe a weird scenario where somehow it just didn't get on the radar of the right people. And I was wrong. I found out that places like that were completely unregulated. Nobody knew what was in them. Nobody knew how many there were or anything else. So my initial estimate of trying to tackle this and deal with it was 18 months. Now it's from that starting point, it's 38 years later. When you look at animals in captivity, wildlife in captivity, but also animals in other situations, whether it's agriculture or laboratories or whatever, you see that they are typically inhabiting spaces that are orders of magnitude smaller than the smallest home ranges that species would ever experience in the wild. And I'll give you an example. If you look at polar bears, which are the widest ranging terrestrial carnivore on the planet, well, the biggest polar bear exhibit in the world is more than 4 million times smaller than the smallest known home range for polar bears in the wild. And if you look right across the continuum of species, from mammals to birds to reptiles, amphibians, fish and invertebrates, all of them, you see that typically that's what animals are experiencing, this massive compression from what they should be in into something that by comparison is microscopically small. When I'm talking to young kids, I'll get a kid up out of the audience to stand up. I say, okay, what do you do in the morning? He goes, well, I get up and my clothes are there and I get dressed. And I said, and so for the rest of the day, you just sort of stand by the bed and wait until it's time to go to bed? Is that what you do? And they go, no. I go, well, what do you do? And they say, well, I go and get breakfast and I check my computer to see if my friends have contacted me, and I watch TV, and then I walk to school. And obviously I'm illustrating the fact that even though they're young kids that, are, not able to go out in the world and do everything that they want to do, they are doing things. They wake up, they do things from the time they get out of bed until the time they go to bed. And when I compare that to animals do that too. Mm-hmm. Ones that are often considered sedentary animals, like some of the tortoises and that, they're actually super active animals. Kids get it. So that fourth thing that all animals need is activity and stimulation. Captive wildlife is a provincial jurisdiction. So what we have in Canada is this mishmash of laws, some commonalities, a lot of inconsistencies from province to province and in the territories. There is then also a lower level, being the municipal level, and they are delegated responsibility for animal control. And animal control functions in most provinces include all animals. So it could be giant constricting snakes or zebras or domestic dogs or rabbits. When you look at those bylaws, there are some commonalities right across the country, but there's tremendous inconsistencies because the people who are writing them generally don't have the necessary expertise to actually write them.
The following highlights come from our episode called Animals Used in Research, Teaching, and Testing, published in November 2022. In Canada, there are many different uses of animals in research, teaching, and testing, ranging from non-invasive methods to some of the worst suffering animals endure. This episode discusses the various ways animals are used in science, protections in place for these animals, and how you can help.
We at Vancouver Humane Society are of the mind, based on all the available information we have, that we're at a place now in society where innovation can move past animal use in research, teaching, and testing, and really be even more effective. For a long time, we've had the 3 R's, which are replacement, refinement, and reduction, as it relates to this area of research, teaching, and testing and animal use. But although these are spoken about, it still seems to be common practice for institutions and people involved in them to do what's always been done rather than to consider innovation. The sort of sad reality of this is that it's costing billions of dollars and, more importantly, millions of animal lives unnecessarily.
Toxicity testing tests the degree to which a substance affects an organism. So, for instance, the length of exposure of a substance, like a new chemical, the route of exposure, whether it's toxic through contact to the skin, inhalation, injection, and the concentration of a substance. As you can imagine, it results in pretty severe suffering. It's considered the most harmful use of animals in science, and it commonly causes the most severe level of suffering, and it impacts about 90,000 animals per year in Canada. Testing the substances involves forced ingestion, forced inhalation, and skin and eye irritation. And then if animals don't die as a result of the experiments, they're typically killed afterwards.
What we know is that there's a number of technological innovations that make it possible to learn about biology without intentionally producing animals to be killed for dissection or used for various forms of research, including testing. The Society for Humane Science shares that although 79% of science teachers in British Columbia still do dissection with their students, non-animal alternatives to dissection have been shown to be better in terms of how well they help students meet their learning goals, and they even save time and money.
And you'll still hear people say, well, I understand the harms that animal research causes, but I personally have a loved one with a life-threatening condition, and we need to find a cure for that. And in reality, those two perspectives, the one advocating for animal well-being and the one in favor of making progress for human medical treatments, are becoming more and more aligned, because we've seen that developments using animal-based methods, while they have existed in the past, they're few and far between, and that process might actually be slowing medical progress.
So it's estimated that around 95% of drugs that are shown to be effective in animals failed to be effective in human clinical trials. In some cases, institutions are testing on animals for diseases that don't even occur naturally in those non-human animals. So they have to be artificially created in the animal, creating an unrealistic disease process, and then that results in drug responses that are entirely different than what would occur in a human body.
We've spoken throughout the series about the laws that are in place to prevent animal cruelty and the gaps in those laws that lead to animal suffering. The final episode in this series explores the enforcement of those laws. You can find the episode called Who Ensures Cruelty Laws Are Followed, published in February 2023. When we talk about animal cruelty enforcement, there are cases where the suffering is institutional, such as abuse cases for farmed animals. There are cases where there's been purposeful, sadistic abuse of animals by an individual, and there are cases classified as animal neglect, where the person responsible for the animals often had a lack of knowledge or a lack of resources. And unfortunately, what we end up seeing is that the most widespread suffering is, in fact, caused by institution-level abuse. And yet, when those cases do come out, they tend to get very light sentences, and the corporation involved can continue to keep animals typically. There's typically a few employees that are blamed and they're fired to make the issue seem like it was an individual issue rather than part of a larger institutional problem, even when the company was aware of the abuse.
Individual animal abuse cases are fairly infrequent, and then most of the cases that end up getting reported to enforcement agencies tend to have to do with different types of neglect. So those vary from hoarding to animals in extreme heat and cold, but can also include animals that aren't being treated for veterinary conditions. These cases are certainly more nuanced and complex because the people themselves don't necessarily have intent, and they may be facing financial barriers as well as systemic marginalization that's leading to them not being able to care for the animals in their care. And so they require a more nuanced kind of approach to enforcement.
On-farm monitoring varies by province. As we alluded to earlier, different provinces have different types of enforcement agencies.
In BC, cruelty investigations are performed by the BCSPCA when a cruelty complaint is made. But like I was saying, there's no active monitoring programs on farms led by any kind of third-party agency. Third-party monitoring is the idea that an independent entity is responsible for making assessments as to the well-being of animals. This is actually really tricky to accomplish, the idea of an independent entity, because they have to not have any kind of bias. If farm industry groups themselves try to contract a, we'll call it, quote unquote, independent entity, that entity is beholden to the desires of those groups. One way it could work is for an entity like the SPCA to manage an agency that does the monitoring. But the trick of that is that the information for the audits wouldn't be publicly available because they're a private entity. So the best case scenario is an agreement between industry, government, nonprofit or SPCA, and independent contractor that would allow audits to occur and the results to be made publicly available. But the reason this isn't happening now is that this kind of system doesn't work in favor of the farmed animal industry or government.
Last year, the BCSPCA announced that they would be conducting 12 spot checks of farms per year with a veterinarian and also an SPCA officer and a Ministry of Agriculture staffer as a pilot project. But after they announced that, they were met with industry backlash, and a lot of that was specifically coming from the BC Cattlemen's Association in particular. I think that's really interesting to note, given that more people are increasingly wanting transparency about what happens to animals on farms, and that includes people who purchase and consume animal products. So that should leave those consumers, I think, wary about what the industry has to hide.
And certainly there's so much opportunity to find a middle ground. And what we're seeing is just an unwillingness to find a middle ground and a solid commitment to having no eyes on farms at all. We can't talk about farmed animals on farms without thinking about farmed animals in other contexts, because maybe life on a farm is, maybe it's okay, maybe it's not, but there's other aspects like transport, going to auction facilities, and slaughter that have really big impacts on farmed animal lives. So to talk about the enforcement of that, when it comes to transport and slaughter as well, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, or CFIA, is responsible for responding to complaints. They typically respond with fines, even for egregious suffering, and they don't refer cases for legal proceedings that would involve any kind of jail penalties. So they just continually use what they call administrative monetary penalties. To change laws and policies to get this proactive monitoring that we're talking about, and cameras in slaughter facilities, as well as funding for enforcement, big changes are needed in the attitudes of the public to actually push the government to prioritize these issues. Without public support, politicians tend to see these issues essentially as niche. So these issues seem to drop to the bottom of the pile.
The biggest and the most important thing we can do to improve enforcement is really to be active citizens, both with our peers and with politicians at the local, provincial, and federal level. That's all for this month. Thank you so much for listening. If you found any of this information helpful, I hope you'll listen to some of the episodes we highlighted today. I also hope you'll join us again next month when we dive back in with a discussion on what your relationship with your pet says about you. The Informed Animal Ally is a podcast by the Vancouver Humane Society. If you found this episode helpful, please consider giving us a 5-star rating and review to help us reach more supporters of animals. To support this project and other initiatives to build a kinder world for animals, you can make a donation at vancouverhumane.ca. You can also follow the Vancouver Humane Society on Facebook at Vancouver Humane Society, Instagram at Vancouver Humane, or Twitter at VanHumane. The music in this episode is the song Jonah's Message for New York by Dr. Turtle, licensed under the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International Public License. Thank you for listening, and thank you for being an animal ally.